I will now unravel the mystery for you. What football has to do with learning, those of you who were here last time, remember I talked about 3 different ways to think, that help you think effectively, thinking on paper and thinking out loud, and thinking in questions. And this is about questions that you can ask that will help you to think effectively. Remember, if you were here last time, I talked about how people think in statements too much. We use periods at the end of our internal sentences too much. Like math or social studies. I hate social studies. That's a statement, okay? A question is, okay, what does this particular thing I'm studying in social studies have to do with the way things are now? That's something that gets you thinking more, okay? And we're going to talk about some questions that will help you here, and in particular, just how you approach thinking and making good decisions. Now, what football has to do with it is this. There was an NFL executive, Mike Lombardi, who said that there are 2 different kinds of coaches. He said there are actual coaches who coach, and then he said there are some coaches who are just play stealers. Now, I'm not going to mention any names here. I just went with a picture of a burglar. Okay, I could have put a particular coach's name up there, I guess. But there may be Patriots fans in here, so I'm kidding, if any of you are Patriots fans. So I went with just this, play stealers. He said some coaches are not real coaches, they're just play stealers. He said what that means is that when they're putting their playbook together and they're thinking about, okay, what would we do if it's, say, 3rd and 8 and we got the ball on the 40? What kind of play would we run? He said these play stealers basically just copy what other people do. They say, okay, what would name your coach? Nick Saban or Lane Kiffin, as bad as I hate to say it, because I'm a big State fan, but he's a great offensive mind. Or Mike Leach. What would they do in this situation? And then just basically run that play. Okay? Mike Leach would pass it, regardless of what down it is. Okay? Just throw it to different people in different situations. So, who would he throw it to? This is called analogy thinking. An analogy is something that resembles something else. So it would be, okay, it's 3rd and 8, I'm going to take what this other coach would run, and what I'm going to run is going to be very, very similar to what he would run. Does that make sense? That's how play stealers think. He said actual coaches engage in something called first principles thinking, which is also known as analytics. Roughly, they're the same thing. He said this coach doesn't look at this situation and say, what would this other coach do? This coach looks at this situation and says, how does football work? How do plays work? What are the formations? What are the rules? At the very basic level, how would a play like this work? And they would build a play from there. What players do I have? What are their strengths? All this kind of stuff. And they would build a play up from there. Now, they're not reinventing the wheel, understand. But they are taking what they learned from other people and breaking it down to the very basic level and then building from there. Now, the key, I'll give you some examples in a second, but the key to this, you must know, is simplicity. Breaking things down to the simplest level. Simplicity is very important. Albert Einstein supposedly said that when you're trying to understand something, he said, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it. You have to be able to break it down that simply to really be able to understand it. You have to really drill down, and you have to play a less annoying version of a game called How Come, which is a little game that a buddy of mine I grew up with used to like to play with people. He was real mischievous and liked to try to get a rise out of you, if y'all know people like that. And so, some people in here might be like that. Well, this is something that you can do to stomp on that last nerve for people. It's called, just like him, stomp her. You okay? How, he would play a little game called How Come. Do you need medical attention? You really? Let's, Miss Sandy should be back in a little bit. Hey, prop it up, like cross it, something like that to reduce the blood flow. Or yeah, let's get him a stool over here. You never know what's going to happen around here. So anyway, Stephen would play this game called How Come, and it was real simple. He'd ask you a question, and no matter what you answered, he'd say, How come? And no matter what the next answer was, he'd say, How come? And on down the line until you were ready to slap him. So he might ask me, for instance, when we were in high school, who's your favorite basketball player? And in high school, I would have said Dominique Wilkins. Does anybody know who Dominique Wilkins is at all? He was a great player back in the 80s, okay? And so he would say, okay, how come? And I'd say, well, he's a great player. Well, how come? Well, because he's a great scorer. He had this great turnaround jump shot, and he had a 48-inch vertical leap, just like Michael Jordan. He was a contemporary of Michael Jordan, and both of them had a 48-inch vertical leap. If y'all don't know what that is, that's you stand still without taking a step, you jump up, and then measure how high your sneakers are off the ground. 4 feet in his case. So he had this great turnaround jumper. Well, how come? Well, I don't know, Stephen, because he worked at it and he kept, well, how come? I like the way he dunked, okay? He'd finally just, enough. You have to do a slight version of that. Not quite like that, but you have to drill down in this way. Does that make sense to everybody? So this is what I'm talking about. Now, some of the smartest people in the world use this line of thinking, this line of reasoning, including Elon Musk. And you know, all know who Elon Musk is, right? He's not just, you've never heard of Elon Musk. Okay. So he's probably, he's not just the guy who was smoking up on the Rogan podcast, okay? He's also one of perhaps the most brilliant engineer on the planet. A very, very smart guy. And of course started Tesla, and of course now has SpaceX, and builds rocket ships for the United States. He also started PayPal, if you didn't, he invented PayPal. And so he said that when thinking about starting SpaceX, their space company, he said, all right, what can we build a rocket ship for? He said, in trying to think about that, how do you start a space company? He said a lot of people would use the copying method, that analogy thinking, and say, okay, how much does a rocket cost? Well, it turns out a rocket costs $65 million. That might be a little bit steep to start a space company, okay? He might have to reach into the back pocket for that one. Elon Musk is very wealthy. But he said $65 million, that's a little bit too much. He said the coaching method, this first principles thinking, you wouldn't ask how much does a rocket ship cost. You would ask, what's a rocket made of? What kind of materials are in a rocket? And it has copper and titanium, and he listed out all the basic elements of a rocket ship. And as it turns out, the cost of the materials is about 2% of what a rocket actually costs. So once he got his head around that, he saw that you can build a rocket ship for a whole lot less than that. The next thing you know, they're building rockets they can afford to build. Next thing you know, we've got SpaceX, and they're in outer space. So that's what I'm talking about, is breaking it down to the basic level. Well, that's fine for rocket ships, but what does all this have to do with learning? All right, I want you to imagine that you are preparing to take the ACT test, which you know we will pay for the first time that you take it once you finish your HSE diploma. All right. So let's say you're getting ready to prepare for the ACT test, and you are particularly worried about the science test. This is what it looks like right here, okay? Doesn't this look like fun, sitting down to answer a question like this? This is pretty hard reading, isn't it? And so, well, let's just read a little bit of it, just for grins and giggles, okay? It says, take my glasses off so I can see. 3 studies compared the effects of 5 sweeteners K through U, on food consumption by rats and on the concentration of leptin and ghrelin, hormones that regulate appetite, in the blood of rats. Sweeteners K through U differ only in the percent biomass of fructose and glucose. Is anybody lost yet?
Yeah.
Me too. We
We
all got, exactly. You get lost halfway through it because it's complicated reading, is it not? Now, people who do this analogy thinking, this place stealing thinking, would say, okay, how do people normally read hard stuff? I'm going to have to be able to read this in order to do well on the test. How do people normally read the hard stuff? Well, a common answer for people is just to read it over and over again until you got it, right? Do you think that will work with this? No. I could just read straight through this 10 times and still not make any sense out of it. And so what people using this first principles thinking would do would instead say, how does reading work? What do you do when you read? How does reading work? Well, reading works like this. You have letters, and you piece them together, and they have you make words, and each word is an idea, right? And then you piece words together into sentences, and then you have a thought. Ideas put together to make a thought, and then you have paragraphs, and it just gets bigger and bigger. So what is the problem with this? There are some words that I don't know what they mean. You see what I mean? We zero in. That's what Abby and I were talking about, getting real specific earlier. You zero in. What's the specific problem here? I don't know what the heck leptin and ghrelin are. Do you? No idea. It tells us. But when you're reading, and y'all tell me if this is your experience, when you're reading something like this, and you run across these words that you don't have any idea what they mean, like leptin and ghrelin, it's almost like running over a speed bump. Y'all ever been driving along and hit a speed bump that you didn't see? Just driving along, Yes. And then yeah, sometimes that happens too. And it is going to impede your progress forward, is it not? So here's the question. How do we smooth out those speed bumps so that we're able to read it? Well, this idea comes from Get to College. GetToCollege.org is a great website to visit. It's a nonprofit organization that helps people go to college, and they have a lot of good pointers on there. And this is one of the ideas that they have, is that substitute those complicated words with something simpler to understand, so that when you're reading, you don't every time you run across leptin and ghrelin or one of these longer words. Does that make sense to everybody? Let's look and see how we might. Let's break this down real quick. 3 studies compared the effects of 5 sweeteners Q through U. It's not really important that we know that those are sweeteners Q through U, right? We can see that on the table. So what you do now, we can cross that out. We're not even looking at it anymore. And then the next thing that runs the speed bump themselves, leptin and ghrelin. What are those? It says here that they're hormones that regulate appetite. You know what a hormone is? It's a chemical going through your blood that makes you do certain things, right? These are the ones that affect how hungry you are. Just so you'll know, one of them makes you feel hungry, one of them makes you feel full. All right. I think that's right. Close enough for the ACT test, right? So these are hormones that regulate how hungry you are. So why don't we just mark that out and call them hungry 1 and hungry 2, okay? And by the way, if fructose and glucose throws you off, do y'all know what fructose and glucose are? Those are different forms of sugars. If you don't know that, if it helps you could also just call those sugar 1 and sugar 2. And so now, here's what you have instead of what I just read to you. 3 studies, I know what studies are, 3 studies compared the effects of 5 sweeteners on food consumption by rats, on what rats eat, all right? And on the concentration of hungry 1 and hungry 2 in the blood of rats. Sweeteners Q through U differ only in the percent by mass of sugar 1 and sugar 2. And now you can see it on the chart that makes sense, right? Sweetener Q has 100% glucose and 0 fructose, and as you go down the line, it's broken down differently. Does that make sense to everybody? So now we can understand something that is complicated because we have broken it down to its basic level, okay? When I was younger, I was in a band. Well, I'm still in a band, but I was in a different version of that band then. It was a 3-piece. We were a power trio. I was the bass player and the lead singer. And we were a cover band. We played covers. And cover bands are great because they play stuff that you know. When you go out somewhere, you usually want to hear stuff that you know, right? And so that's what we did. And there was another cover band in town that we all went out to see one night. And they were really good. They've been playing together for a long time. And so when they took a break, I went up and talked to the bass player, because we're fellow bass players, we're talking about amps and gear and all kinds of stuff. And I mentioned to him then that, I said, y'all are great, man. Y'all been playing these songs for a long time. I said, we do covers also. But, we've been starting to work in some original songs also stuff that we'd written. He said, let me stop you right there. He said, you can quit doing that right now. Said, nobody cares about your original songs. Nobody, he said to me, nobody makes any money playing original music. I said, well, the Beatles did pretty well. I heard they made a little bit of money. He said, you ain't the Beatles. And he was right about that. I was, in fact, not Paul McCartney, okay? So while it worked out pretty good, it didn't work out too well for me, but it worked out pretty good for the Beatles. And it worked out so well for them because they started out as a cover band. They started out playing other people's songs. The story goes that they were playing, I think, 7 nights a week, and I think they were playing 5-hour gigs. I think it was at a German strip club, if I'm not mistaken. They played a lot of songs, and they learned how to play those songs really well, but they didn't just do what I did, which was to just try to write songs that sound like somebody else. That's the analogy, right? What they did was break music down to its basic elements and figure out on their own what sounds good and what stays with people. And by doing that, they wrote songs that are timeless. People will be singing Hey Jude 500 years from now, probably. And so that's what I'm talking about breaking it down to the basic level like they did. They broke it down, they worked at it, and they didn't quit. And you will amaze yourself with what you can accomplish if you will break it down to the basic level, work at it, and don't quit.